And today's speaker, Professor Ryan Cragun, is in order of importance. I'm sorry, excuse me a moment. Okay. In order of importance, he's a husband, a father, and a sociologist studying worldviews. The focus is on Mormonism and non-religion. His research has been presented in a variety of academic journals, and his book is Organized Secularism in the U.S. and What You Don't Know About Religion But Should. He's twice received the Excellence in Research and Scholarship Award from the College of Social Sciences, Mathematics and Education at the University of Tampa. For more about his work, you can go to his website, www.ryantcragun.com. And with that, I will present Ryan, and you can unmute yourself, Ryan.
Yep.
And I'll turn the screen over to you.
Perfect. And I'm going to try and share my screen. Is that working? Can everyone see that? Fred, I'm hoping you can tell me. Yeah?
Oh,
okay.
yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you for having me today, everyone. I'm excited to give this presentation. This is actually from a book chapter that was published just over a year ago, came out in about May of 2022. It was actually a lot of fun to do this research, and I'll kind of explain why. But thank you, Fred, for the introduction. Okay, so to get started, have any of you ever seen any news headlines like this? Religious people are happier, one study found, and that was from February 6, 2019. So it's like 4 years ago. Or this one, religious people are happier than atheists, finds a study, and this is based on the same kind of research, right? It's February 13th, 2019. I see these news articles and headlines pop up periodically. And somebody who, as a sociologist who studies religion and non-religion, I'm consistently aggravated when I see these headlines, usually because they're probably a misrepresentation of the findings. That's a general problem with media dealing with science anyway. But it's also because a lot of the research that's done on the relationship between religion and happiness is deeply, deeply flawed. And I'm going to go through some of those very serious problems and illustrate why this book chapter is actually a substantial improvement upon that. So I'm going to kind of do a very quick overview of what the problems are, and then I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into each one of those so you've got a sense of why these are problems, and then I'm going to present my research. So all right, so quickly, the background. What are some of these problems? Okay, one of the big ones is that many of the studies that focus on the relationship between religion and happiness use the US exclusively, okay? And while the US is the third most populous country on the planet, we don't contain even a tiny sliver of the world's population, right? So doing studies just on the US is not representative of the entire population of the planet. I think everybody in here, as soon as I say that, you're like, well, obviously that's clear. But that's not how a lot of the research on this topic is actually done. Most of it focuses on these very specific studies that are only on the US. And within the US, many of them are not representative studies, which we'll get to next, right? So I'm going to come back to that. There are very few very representative studies. I'm going to talk about what that means and why this is a problem. And then I'm going to hit probably my biggest point, which is most of these studies, and we'll talk a bit about this, that this presentation is going to get a little wonky on stats, right? So hopefully some of you really like numbers. I'm a numbers guy, but we're going to talk about effect sizes and why effect sizes actually matter quite a bit when we're studying this. And that will come back when I present the results. There's also very limited causal research here, which we're going to come back to and talk a little bit about that. But basically the idea is just because somebody's more or less religious doesn't mean that actually causes their happiness to go up. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the last one is just there's no theory behind why religious people would be happier than non-religious people. There's very little theory on this. So we'll come back to this. All right, so let me just dig into this a little bit for each of those. I'm going to give a little bit of background, and then I'm going to go into my study. So that very first one, the US. The US is weird, right? Let's just like straight up admit this. We're a pretty weird country for a lot of reasons. One of those is among developed nations, the US is disproportionately religious. And I don't want to give the impression that we're really religious. We're actually not. And I'm happy to go through those statistics at the end of the presentation today during the Q&A. We're not nearly as religiously affiliated as people think. So religious affiliation, most of you probably know, is going down, but attendance is way lower than most people think as well. And so are a lot of the belief variables that we actually capture in our surveys. So yeah, we're not really, really religious. We really are not. But we are more religious than a lot of other developed countries. I put the picture up there. I'm guessing most of you know who that person is. This is not meant to be a political presentation, right? I generally try and avoid that because I don't know everybody's political leanings. But there's a reason why Donald Trump walked out of the White House, walked over in front of a church and held a Bible upside down, right? This is basically a call out to very specific segments of the US population to say, hey, trust me, I'm doing this for religious reasons. Again, politics aside, I'm not saying he was, he wasn't, whatever. The symbolism is key, right? And that's why I put it up there. The US is unusual. I would like to see other countries, right, particularly other developed countries, particularly Western developed countries, where the leader of the country would do something like that. It's just so unusual. It would be shocking to see that happen. So we are kind of weird in that sense. Another thing that makes us very, very different from a lot of other countries is we are hyper individualistic in the US. We prioritize the individual over the collective, and that's not true in a lot of other countries around the world. So using the US as a proxy for the entire world's population is actually extremely problematic for a variety of reasons. So studies that only have data from the US are really problematic when we're studying this. All right, so let's move on to another one. What about representative studies? Again, I don't know how much you all know about survey research and sampling, but whenever we're trying to do a study, we want to get what's called a representative sample. What that means is everybody in the population has a chance of being included in the sample, and then we can use that sample, that collection of data, to talk about the entire population, so generalize. Most of the studies on religion and happiness, particularly in the US, do not use representative samples. Okay, they tend to use really obscure samples. So here's a good example of this. If I told you that older Black women in rural Alabama who were religious were slightly happier than those who were not religious, would we assume that that applies to the whole world's population, right? When the study really does focus on older Black women in rural Alabama. And you think I'm joking about this, but that is actually one of the studies. There are a number that are on like older Chinese individuals in upstate Michigan. There's another one that's on older individuals in California. There's actually one on Black individuals in Tampa, where I happen to live. So a lot of these studies are on these really obscure, very specific populations that are not representative of even the US, let alone the entire world's population. So if somebody finds a study or does a study not using a representative sample, and then says, hey, look, there's a relationship between religion and happiness, one of the first questions you should be asking is, that's not a representative study. Why would we even trust this, right? What does this tell us about anything? So we do need to think through some of these questions about, is it representative? The vast majority of positive findings between religion and happiness use samples like this. Now we're going to get to one point that it's actually an extremely important point. It gets lost in most statistical analyses, and certainly most research that makes it into the media does not talk about effect sizes. And this is probably the most important thing that we actually should be reporting in every single study is effect sizes. Okay, so I'm going to just, like I said, I don't mean to get deep into the weeds here. I've got an example that I think makes a lot of sense to help explain this, but just bear with me because it's actually really, really important. When we're doing statistical analyses, right, most people focus on the p-value or whether there's a statistically significant relationship. If you find that there is a statistically significant relationship, all that means is that the relationship you found is so unusual that you can probably rule out chance. Okay, you can't definitively, but you can probably rule out chance. That's what statistical significance means, okay? In a sense, it's kind of like winning the lottery, Okay. And this was obviously in the news quite a bit recently because I guess I don't play the lottery because I teach statistics and I know better than that. But I know that the Mega Millions was like over $1 billion. The odds are really low that you'll win. Okay. So the odds of finding a relationship in some situations are really low. And the way that that plays out is through statistical significance. But, and this is the key point, just because you win the lottery doesn't tell me how much you won, right? So if you win a dollar scratch off, right? That's very different from winning a $750 million Mega Millions jackpot. Okay. The size of how much you won is the effect size. That's what we mean by effect sizes. So just saying that you won doesn't tell me anything about how much you won. If you won $5, is that a life-altering victory that you're going to tell the whole world, hey, I won $5 in the lottery? I don't think you will, right? Now, if you won $1 billion, okay, that's a little bit different. What most of the studies that look at the relationship between religion and happiness leave out is effect sizes. So all they report is, we found a statistically significant relationship. They don't tell you how big it is, okay? And if you don't know how big it is, that's kind of an important problem, because what if the relationship is basically the equivalent of winning $5 in a scratch off? Then why are we making a big deal about there being a relationship between religion and happiness, right? Winning $70 on a scratch off is still winning, but $750 million will change your life. If the relationship between religiosity and happiness was so big that it would actually be a life-altering relationship, then I would be like, okay, that's important. We should actually do something about this. Be skeptical, right? And we're gonna talk more about this. Okay, so we'll come back to effect sizes when I present the results. Two other things real quick. One, effect sizes do range from negligible to large. We'll come back to that. I think you all have heard this phrase, correlation is not causation. Almost all of the research that looks at the relationship between religion and happiness is correlational, including my own. So I'm not even arguing cause in my paper today because cause is really, really challenging to demonstrate. In order to establish causality, you have to actually meet 3 rules, okay? So one, A must precede B in time. So A must cause, like A must be, we're assuming if A is the causal factor and B is what is being caused, right? A must precede B in time. A must be related to B in some fashion. That's what we would call correlation. And A must be dependent upon B alone, or at least in part, and cannot be explained just by C. So you can't have what are called spurious correlations that are actually explaining this. And this is actually, like I said, it's really, really hard to establish causality, but virtually none of the research that studies the relationship between religion and happiness, again, myself included on this one, does not incorporate these rules of causality. It's all correlational research. There are a couple of exceptions that do longitudinal research where you can do a better job of establishing causality, but for the most part, it just doesn't exist out there. So the gold standard would be experimental research, where you assign people, just do a thought experiment with me for a second, where you assign people who are equally happy or unhappy to attend religions or don't attend religions, right? And then look at the outcomes. That would be the gold standard, but I don't know that that's ethical to actually do that. So we haven't done that, but that would actually be the gold standard. We don't have that. Next best would be longitudinal. And like I said, there's very limited, I've seen like 3 of these and the results are quite mixed. So we can come back to that if you have questions about it. All right, last point, theory. I teach my students this, literally my first year freshman students in college, that just because we have data doesn't mean it's actually that useful unless we can explain it. We have to have a theory to explain the data. And what's missing from most of this research is, in fact, the theory. So they may find occasionally a statistically significant, no effect sizes, but a statistically significant relationship. But why would religiosity improve happiness? And I think that's an important question that everybody looking at this should be asking, right? What is it about religiosity that would actually do this? Affiliation makes little sense, right? So just saying I'm a Catholic, why would that make somebody happier than a non-Catholic, right? If I'm a Muslim, why would that make somebody happier than somebody who's not a Muslim? There's no reason that affiliation would actually make a lot of sense. There is one bit of theory that might make sense, and that's attendance, okay? But it's not the attendance that actually does it. It's that you can develop friends at church, right? And there's actually really good research by a friend of mine, Luke Galen, that showed if you compare people who regularly attend a free thought group, like the one I'm speaking to right now, to people who regularly attend religious services, there's no difference in positive outcomes. So it's actually the social support that accounts for it, not actually doing it through a church. So it's all about social support. If you have a strong social support network, religiosity should make no difference. And I actually show this in some of my other research as well with the same co-author, David Speed. Anyway, so that's the theory angle, which is kind of tricky. There's no reason to think that beliefs would do this. Why would believing in angels make somebody happier than not believing in angels? Why would believing that, a God was crucified on a cross make somebody happier than not believing that, right? There's no real logical kind of sequence of arguments that would say, oh, that's why, right? It's really just the one argument, which is you can develop friends at church and that might make a difference. Otherwise, there's no reason to think there'd be a relationship. Okay. So that's kind of the background. That's a lot of the problems that exist in the literature on this. And when I say there's a lot of literature on this, there are literally hundreds of peer-reviewed articles that have been published on this relationship, and they continue to be published on a regular basis. All of these problems are what led me to want to write this book chapter. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this and wrestle with this for a minute. I was approached by the editor of this book. It's an edited volume, so there are like 10, 12 different essays in here. The book is actually called, and I don't remember the name of the actual book. I showed it at the beginning, but the focus is on the relationship between religiosity and happiness. And the editor wanted me to write a chapter on non-religion and happiness. And I said, that's actually not what I want to do. I want to do this, right? I want to look at the relationship between religiosity and happiness and basically illustrate that it doesn't exist. And the editor wasn't super keen, but agreed to let me do it. So one of the nice things about book chapters is they're actually very different from journal articles. You can actually do very different things. And this book chapter is very different, right? If I had to write a journal article, it follows a very specific pattern. You have to do this, that, and the other. Book chapters, you can be a bit more creative, and that's what I was allowed to do in this one. So I did end up writing this book chapter, which actually undermines the entire purpose of the book, which I feel a little bit bad about, but I'm not going to apologize for actually doing good research on this point. So I did have an idea. I ran it by the editor. She said I could do it, so I did it, and that's how we got this chapter. Okay, so that's a bunch of background to get to the actual study. Now let me go through what I actually did and the relationships that we find between religion and happiness. Methodologically, I mentioned I'm a numbers guy. I like doing statistical analyses. I teach statistics, so I'm using a bunch of data. Okay, this survey is called the World Values Survey. It's wave 6, so the study came out a little while ago. There's now a wave 7 that's just recently been released, so I could certainly update this. But wave 6 was collected between 2010 and 2014, and it includes representative samples from 60 countries around the world. Okay, so you'll notice already that I'm addressing 2 of the major concerns that I raised with existing research. A lot of that research focuses just on the US and it doesn't use representative samples. I have 60 countries. Some of the core variables are missing in some of those, so we don't always have the stuff that we need. So sometimes the analysis drops to like 55 countries, but I have 60 countries with big representative samples, which means I can actually generalize to the entire country. So I'm addressing 2 of those concerns right from the get-go. So that's the data. I could go into more of the data. The data are publicly available too. So if anybody ever was like, hey, I'd like to see this and verify your numbers, you're more than welcome to. It's all publicly available data. Okay, now, from just a methodological standpoint, okay, and I'm gonna, again, I'm not trying to get too deep into the weeds. I think this is pretty straightforward, but whenever you're doing these kinds of analyses, you have what are called dependent variables. That's the variable you're trying to explain, and the independent variable. My dependent variable, of course, is a measure of happiness. It's a self-reported measure of happiness, which is kind of standard. This is how most people do it, and that's how the variable is worded. Taking all things together, would you say you are not at all happy, not very happy, rather happy, and very happy? So higher scores means you're happier, okay? And it is a self-report measure. So that's the dependent variable. And then what I'm doing is looking at a number of other variables to see if they predict this dependent variable, okay? Not arguing causality, it's just the language we use in statistics. All right, so that's my dependent variable, and then I have 3 independent variables. There's a reason why we have 3, because people can be religious in different ways, okay? So I've got 3 independent variables that I'm going to examine here. The first one is perhaps one of the worst questions ever, but, and I can come back to that, if somebody wants to make a note about this question and come back in the Q&A and remind me, I'm happy. I wrote an entire article about how terrible this question is. So here's the question. Independently of whether you attend religious services or not, would you say you are? And then they give people 3 response options, okay? Religious, not religious, or a convinced atheist. That's the actual language that they use, and it's such a terrible question. For this analysis, I combined the last 2 groups, not religious and atheist. So I'm basically just comparing not religious and atheist to religious, and then we're looking at those 2 groups and comparing them on how happy they are. Okay, so that's the first variable, and this is basically kind of a measure of like affiliation. Then we have a measure of belief in God, right? So how important is God in your life? And this can range from not at all important to very important, not at all being a 1, 10 being very important, okay? So that's a belief measure, because people can say they don't have a religion but believe in God. People can say they have a religion but don't believe in a God. So people can vary along these dimensions. So we've got to capture at least 2. And the last one is a behavior dimension. So this one is apart from weddings and funerals, about how often do you attend religious services these days. 1 is never, 7 is more than once a week. So again, we can compare people and say, all right, if they attend religious services more frequently, does that make them happier? That's basically the idea. Again, I'm analyzing all of these separately because these are different dimensions of how religious people can be. And then we're going to look at the outcomes to see if any of these are related to happiness. Okay. And do keep in mind, I'm doing lots and lots of analyses. So I'm going to try and simplify this as much as possible to keep this pretty straightforward. I do have a link to the full paper or full chapter at the end. So anybody's welcome to download it. It's on my website. You can download it and read it. All right. Quick technical side note. I apologize again for getting a little bit into the weeds on the statistics, but there are a couple of things that are worth noting. So statistical significance, depending on your alphas, is basically a set level of how often you're going to be wrong. The default that most people in the social sciences and actually natural sciences use is an alpha of 0.05, which means you're going to be wrong 1 time in 20. And it's pretty straightforward. This is kind of standard. That's where you get the p equals 0.05, right? That's what that means. The problem with that is that if you do a whole bunch of calculations to determine whether relationships are statistically significant, your odds of being wrong on any one of those actually go up. So this is a technical side note. If there's anybody in here who cares about statistics, there's a way to address this. It's called a Holm-Bonferroni correction. I'm not going to go into all the details on how that's done. I'm just going to note that I did this because most of the other studies don't do this, and I think it's the right way to do it. Anyway, so there are Holm-Bonferroni corrections. All right. Last thing, link to the paper at the end. All the detailed tables are in the paper. So if you have specific questions, if you want more information on the methodology, obviously you can ask me in the Q&A, or you can just read the paper. There's a link to it at the end. I'm going to show very simplified charts. Okay, I'm trying to make this as easy to understand as possible. I think it's pretty intuitive because I don't want to get, like I said, too deep into the weeds. So what I'm actually showing is effect sizes. Remember, this is not whether there's a statistically significant relationship. This is what is the size of the lottery winnings, okay? And remember, those can range from negligible all the way up to really big. Negligible would be like I won $5 in a scratch off. Really big would be I just won the Mega Millions and I walked home with $750 million, okay? So we can have different effect sizes. That's what I'm plotting because that's what I want to show you. And again, we're looking at roughly 60 countries around the world, okay? So let's look at data. We're going to just kind of dig into the data here, and hopefully this makes sense to everybody. So here's our first one. I'm going to kind of walk you through what this chart is showing, okay? So what we have is the effect of religious identity. That's, are you religious, not religious, or an atheist? That's the question. That's effect on happiness. And again, we're plotting effect sizes. Down here at the bottom, what you have are 6 countries, okay? I put 6 in because there were only 3 that had a statistically significant relationship here. And I was like, I'm just going to put 3 more in because the chart looks really small with only 3. The three that actually have a statistically significant relationship are India, Turkey, and the United States. Okay, so out of 60 countries where I did this analysis, the statistically significant relationship, so they won the lottery, right, only existed in 3 countries. Now we're plotting effect sizes. So I'm going to show you the effect sizes here, and I'm just going to run this out and illustrate this. We have very small effects, right? That would be anything from here down would be a small effect size. Anything below this red line right here is considered negligible. It is so small that this is literally meaningless. It means nothing. There is nothing going on here, okay? So anything below this red line at the very bottom, if that's the size of the effect, it's meaningless, okay? Then we have a medium effect up here, and then we have a large effect, anything above 0.5, okay? So hopefully you're already catching what I'm getting at here. Out of 60 countries around the world, when we look at the relationship between saying, I'm religious and how happy somebody is, this is statistically significant in just 3 countries, India, Turkey, and USA. And the size of the effect is so small that it's not even small. It's negligible, okay? Which means in 57 other countries, there is no relationship here. None. There's nothing happening. And even in the 3 where there is something, it's so small that it's like winning a $5 scratch off. Hopefully this makes sense, okay? If you have questions, we can certainly capture it at the end. All right, so that's my first of 3 independent variables. Let's move on to our next independent variable. So those were the statistically significant ones. This is the effect of religious belief. So how important is God in your life? All of these countries down here at the bottom, okay? So for all of these countries, there is a statistically significant relationship. So there's like 14. So it's a bit more, right? Out of 60, there's like 14, 15, where there is a statistically significant relationship. But again, how big is it? We care about the effect sizes because if this isn't big enough to even be a small effect, you didn't win anything meaningful, right? So let's put the effect sizes on. There's our small effect size. Okay, so it's right there. It's like 0.25-ish, something like that. We have 2 countries that actually have effect sizes that are big enough to be considered small effects, okay? Then we add the others. So there's medium and large effects. All the rest, they are statistically significant, but they're negligible. There's nothing meaningful going on here. And it's worth noting in Rwanda, the relationship is actually the opposite. People who say they're not religious are actually happier than people who say they are religious. So the one variable that has the biggest effect size out of all of these countries has the opposite effect of what most people seem to think is the relationship between religiosity and happiness. Yemen also had a negative relationship. So very, very small effect sizes. Basically, 2 have small effect sizes. Everything else is negligible. Okay, we just have one more. This is attendance, okay? So we're looking at the relationship between religiosity and attendance. And I do want to note one other thing real quick. The US is right there, right? I noted this as one of the problems with the existing literature. So the US is, again, statistically significant on this. So it was statistically significant on the first one. It is on this one. Now let's look at our third measure, okay? Very similar. So we have, again, something like 13, 14 countries where there is a statistically significant relationship between religious attendance and happiness. That's what we're looking at here, okay? So for all of these countries, there is a statistically significant relationship. Now we lay on effect sizes to see how big is the relationship. There is small, okay? Then we have medium and large. Out of all of those countries, 1 has a small effect. And guess which country it is? It's right there in the bottom right corner, the US. Okay, so as we're looking through this, right, the US is really the only country out of all 60 countries that has a statistically significant relationship between religiosity and happiness on all 3 measures. Okay, Turkey has it on 2, India has it on 2, but it's literally the US is the only country that has a statistically significant relationship between religiosity and happiness measured in 3 different ways. And in 2 of those 3 cases, the effect size is negligible, meaning it doesn't matter. It's not even like winning a dollar scratch off, right? It's like nothing. It's nothing. Only on one of them is there a small effect, which means it's like winning $60 on a scratch off. That's it. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to everybody. I'm going to turn to the discussion. We'll kind of wrap this up and then I'll open it up to Q&A. So what does all this mean? Okay. Statistically significant relationships between religious belief, behavior, and belonging and happiness do exist in a handful of countries around the world. That is true. Okay, so I'm not denying that those statistically significant relationships do exist, but the relationship is so small that it means nothing. Okay, that's the big takeaway from this chapter. This took me months of doing statistical analyses, right? Literally hundreds of statistical analyses to do this. That's the big takeaway. Most of the existing research on this does not capture effect sizes, doesn't report those. I did, and I did it for this reason specifically, because the relationships are negligible. Okay, what that means from a clinical standpoint, I'm going to kind of give an example. Okay, the effects are subclinical. No therapist should recommend religion as a treatment for depression. I actually had this conversation at a conference. I was at a conference in Las Vegas. I was not doing anything else in Las Vegas. I was in a conference the whole time. And I remember I was in this like downstairs room in a conference center, and there were three presentations on the relationship between religiosity and health, actually, in this case, not happiness, but health. And all three presentations said that there was a statistically significant relationship between religiosity and health. One of the presenters was a physician, an MD, okay, who made this point. And at the Q&A, I raised my hand, and for all three of the presenters, I said, okay, you said that there was a statistically significant relationship. What was the effect size? And all three of them said, I didn't measure the effect size, I don't know, which was fascinating, right? After the session is over, the physician comes up to me and he's like really upset at me. And he's like, why are you so like, why are you pushing against this relationship? And I said, look, you're a physician, right? And he says, yeah. And I said, you have patients? Yeah. If you had a patient come to you who said, I'm not religious and I've got some health problems, would you recommend that he become religious? And he's like, absolutely not. That would be a violation of like, my codes of ethic. I would never do that. And I was like, that's because the relationship is so small. If religion really did make a huge difference, I would totally backtrack here and I'd be like, hey, look, there's a huge difference. We should all be religious if we care about our happiness. It doesn't. That's the big takeaway. So coming back to all those problems that I mentioned right at the beginning, if we think about this, many studies on the US only. Why do they focus on the US only? Because the US is weird. I just established this, right? On all three measures, the US stood out as having a statistically significant relationship. No other country out of the 60 had the same relationship. So the US is very weird. If you use representative studies, turns out you find really different results, right? In the vast majority of these, there's no relationship whatsoever. Most of those studies do not report effect sizes. There's a reason why they don't report effect sizes, is because when you do report effect sizes, it's pretty clear there is no meaningful relationship here. There's nothing going on. There's no relationship between religiosity and happiness. Limited causal research. Mine is not an improvement on that. I'm not trying to make the claim that my research is causal, so please don't take that away from this. I'm not arguing that it's causal. And then there's no theoretical rationale. I'm arguing that there is no reason to think that there would be a relationship between religiosity and happiness, except maybe by making friends at church. But you can also do that outside of church, and so it's friends that make a difference, not church. All right, that's my big kind of discussion point there, which means all of those previous studies and those headlines that say, hey, religious people are happier than non-religious people, it's bullshit. That's the actual answer. It's not there. There's nothing going on. Somebody probably found a statistically significant relationship using some non-representative sample in some weird population in the US, and then they found some reporter who was willing to make a big deal out of this, when in reality, there's nothing going on. What's the conclusion? Religious people are not happier than non-religious people. I wrote that in the book chapter. You can see that in the book chapter. That's the conclusion in the book chapter, which is loads of fun that I got to put that in print. If someone claims that religious people are happier than non-religious people, you should immediately ask them, what is your source? Was it a representative sample? Is it the US only? Ask them about effect sizes, and more than anything, send them a copy of my chapter. That QR code and that link will take you directly to my chapter. I'm going to leave that up here for a second in case anybody wants to scan it with their phone, or if they want to kind of type that in. You can also just kind of go to Google and type in my name, Ryan Cragun, and Religiosity and Happiness, Much Ado About Nothing. It should take you directly to my website, or just go to my website, ryantcragun.com, quickly search through, and you will find it. So I'm going to leave that for like 5 seconds more. If somebody wants me to put it up later, I can. And with that, I am done, and I'm going to open up for questions, and I'm going to stop my share so we can see everybody else. Okay.
I can.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm going to stop the recording. And